Hi, I'm Ginny Sain, and I am here to talk to you today about using setting in the stories that you're writing, and particularly using setting as a character in your manuscript or in your work in progress. And we're going to talk a little bit about ways to use setting that will really make your work stand out and separate it from some of the other things that your agent you're querying or the editor you're querying or the reader that you're trying to appeal to might read. Setting is a great way to make your manuscript unusual, a way to separate it from everything else and just really make it sing. So we're going to talk about some ways to do that. Before we get started on that, I'll tell you a little bit about me really quickly. I grew up in a writing family, but I never really wanted to be a writer. Theater was always my art form. That's always what I've done. I've spent most of my life teaching and directing theater, mostly with high school students and college students, which is why I write YA, because I love working with that age group. But the techniques that I'm going to talk about today are certainly applicable no matter what age category or what genre you're writing in. So don't worry if you're not necessarily writing YA, that's fine. You'll still be able to use all these tips and tricks. I have 3 books that are out right now. Well, 2 that are out right now, one that's getting ready to be out. My first book, Dark and Shallow Lies, this was published in 2021 by Penguin Random House. Dark and Shallow Lies is a New York Times bestseller. It was an Amazon editor's pick, a Barnes and Noble YA book of the month, all sorts of things like that were really cool and exciting for my first book. This book is set in the bayous of Louisiana, down in a very, very tiny town that calls itself the psychic capital of the world. So it has a really unusual setting that a lot of people love. My second book, this one came out in 2022. This is Secrets So Deep. This book is set at a theater in Connecticut on the seaside. It's a really sort of fog shrouded, mysterious place where strange things happen. It's about ghosts and memory and hauntings, but kind of different ways there are to be haunted. So this one also has a really unusual setting. It's that foggy seaside theater kind of setting, which is really special and different. And then this is my third book. This one will come out actually March 5th of 2024. So just 2 months from now when I'm recording this video. This book is actually set in Florida where I live now. I didn't live here when I wrote the book, but I do now. And it's set in the freshwater springs of Central Florida. It's about a girl who is a diver, a free diver in those beautiful freshwater springs we have here in this part of the state. And she is interested in a cold case mystery in the little Florida town where she grew up, and she gets pulled into that. So all 3 of these books have really unusual, really lush, really vivid settings. And those are things that get mentioned a lot in reviews. All 3 of those books have gotten really great reviews from Kirkus and for the Bulletin, for children's books and all sorts of other trade journals and things. And one of the things that always gets mentioned is the setting and how special the settings are and how much the settings pull readers into the story. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, and some ways you can do that with your work to really make your stories stand out. So there are other things these stories have in common too. I tend to write dark, sort of twisty thrillers, thrillers that have a little bit of the magical or the paranormal running through them. I tend to deal with themes like generational secrets, and things like that kind of pop up again and again in my work. And I'm really drawn toward sort of wild rural places that have some sort of magical quality to them or some sort of in-between quality to them. I say that I'm sort of drawn to in-between spaces as far as settings go, sort of places that exist between the land and the sea, or between reality and fantasy, kind of those in between marginal spaces. That's where I like to set my stories. So one thing that's really interesting about me is that I start my stories thinking about setting first. That's generally the thing that comes to me first. I think most the time when writers get asked that question, what do you start or how do you start out telling a story? The answer a lot of times is, oh, I have an idea for a plot. I have an idea for something that's going to happen. So that's a pretty common answer. Or sometimes it'll be a character. I have this character that came into my head and I really wanted to tell a story about this character. But for me, the first thing that happens is I get an idea of a place that I want to set a story. There's something about place that has always really pulled me and appealed to me and drawn me in. I've always been drawn to places where things happen. I remember going to London years and years and years ago and standing in the spot where Anne Boleyn was executed and having just such a sense of place and the things that had happened in that ground that I stood on. So place has always been really, really, really important to me. When I started thinking about Dark and Shallow Lies, I hadn't been writing seriously. I'd been kind of writing off and on, but I was mostly doing theater. But I had stumbled across a little town called Cassadaga, Florida. And Cassadaga really does bill itself as the psychic capital of the world. If any of you have ever been to Cassadaga or get a chance to go, it's this tiny little place, just a little sort of town square, and it is full of really nothing but tarot readers and crystal shops and rock shops and all sorts of wonderful things like that. And I thought, as I was standing there on the porch of this little bookstore in Cassadaga, Florida, what an interesting place to set a story. And this question came to me, and that question was, how would you keep a secret in a town full of psychics? So I thought, well, that is a really interesting question. I really want to go with that story, but I knew I wanted to set it there in that town of psychics. The thing is, though, Cassadaga, Florida is right on I-4, which is a really busy stretch of interstate. You can hop right off the interstate and be there, hop back on and get away. And I wanted someplace that was harder to get to and harder to get away from. So I decided to set my story in a fictional place, La Cachette, Louisiana, that was a mixture of Cassadaga, Florida, and a town called Pilotstown, Louisiana. Pilotstown, Louisiana was a tiny little town that existed down at the very bottom of the Mississippi River, right before it splits out into the Gulf of Mexico. And it existed for riverboat pilots and their families. And what it was back in the day, if you had a big ship, cargo ship out in the Gulf of Mexico, and you needed to get that ship upriver to port in New Orleans, then the person who was in charge of that vessel at sea could not pilot that boat up the river to New Orleans because the Mississippi River was too treacherous, too dangerous. You had to have a riverboat pilot to do that, someone who really knew the river. So they would stop there at Pilotstown. They would take on a riverboat pilot who would get their ship upriver safely to New Orleans. And that's who lived in Pilotstown. It was just riverboat pilots and their families. It was built on a boardwalk, no access by roads, only accessible by boat. And I combined those two places, Pilottown, Louisiana, and Cassadaga, Florida, to come up with a mythical town of La Cachette, Louisiana, which is the place where Dark and Shallow Lies takes place. So I used a little bit of a fictional place and a little bit of a real place. So you can do that, as you're putting your stories together. But whether you're creating a real place or you're setting your stories in a fictional real town you're making up, or you're making up a completely fantasy setting, maybe you're writing sci-fi or fantasy and you're completely making up the place. I'm going to give you a couple of tips here that can really help you as far as making sure that your world you're creating really stands out. So here's what I want you to think about first. As you're thinking about your story and where it's set, I want you to think about how you're going to use that story to really bring out that setting and how you're going to use that setting to bring out the story. The story, if it feels like it could be set anywhere else, then you're really not using that setting to your full advantage. If you're really using your setting right, your story will feel like it couldn't possibly happen the way it happens if it were set any place other than where it is set. So here's how you make that happen. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Number one, the first important thing to remember is that you want to use as many details as possible. Now, writers know that. We hear that all the time. Use details, be specific. But I want to talk to you about the kind of details to use in your setting. The kind of details you should use in your setting are tiny, specific details, little bitty things. Know the tiny things. Picture looking at your setting through a big wide angle lens. You see the whole thing, the whole forest, the whole village, the whole castle, wherever your setting is. You see all of it. And then I want you to zoom in as tight as you can on that setting until you see a tiny little bit of it. And that's what I want you to describe to me. You can tell us so much about a place by using a tiny, specific, vivid image, much more than you can about using a large image. A small, clear image tells us so much about a bigger world. So instead of describing a vast, marshy landscape, how big it is, lots of trees, lots of water, describe one single tree for us. Describe the tree at the edge of the water that's become so swollen from water that its trunk has split open. Tell us about the curling leaves that float in the black water around its base, or the Spanish moss that drips from a specific limb. Tell us about that specific tree. And if you tell us about that specific tree, we will see the whole forest in a much clearer image than if you just try to tell us about the whole forest. Same thing goes for, say, describing a village, a fictional village, whether it's a real village, that you've decided to set your story in, or a village you're creating, or a total fantasy world. Instead of telling us about the village in loose, sort of large terms, like there are cobblestone streets and lots of old houses, zoom in close on one specific thing. Tell us how the cobblestone streets have gaps in them that are just wide enough to get your heel caught so that you almost trip as you walk down the street. Zoom in on a specific house. Tell us about the way the paint is peeling on the shutters, and the way the leaning steps have sort of sunken into the dirt and leaned to one side. Give us very specific, detailed, zoomed in images. If you give us those specific images of those gaps in the cobblestones and those leaning steps, then we'll see the whole village. We'll get a clearer image of the whole village than if you tried to tell us the whole entire thing at once. So use lots of little specific images. I'm going to read you really quickly an excerpt. This is from One Last Breath, which comes out, like I said, March of this year, 2024. And in this book, in this section, the main character, True, is sitting out on her steps and she's looking around at the houses sort of around her house. And she's sort of describing them. So listen to the way she specifically describes these houses. I let my eyes travel across the grass, or what passes for grass in our yard. It's mostly stickers and sand with patchy bits of green, more weeds than lawn. If John Boy didn't help us out by mowing it ever so often, it'd be all grown wild and tangled, just like the scrub. I look up at a sliver of moon hanging low in the sky just over the house across the road. The blue paint is peeling so bad it looks like the house has some kind of disease. The blinds are open and I see Mr. and Mrs. Binger sitting in their matching recliners watching TV. I turn to the west and take in John Boy's manatee-shaped mailbox. It seems out of place on the dry, dusty dirt road, like the poor animal is trying to hitchhike its way back to the water. There's a rusting golf cart parked in his carport, even though he doesn't play golf. Reese did, and their dad did. The two of them used to organize a big tournament every year for the Florida Press Association. I can still see the old FPA sticker slapped on the back bumper at an odd angle. On the other side of us, in a sagging trailer my mother sold them, are the Keppers. Their front porch is still strung up with Christmas lights, just to add that festive touch of year-round cheer. I stare at the blinking red and green bulbs, try to count the missing ones, as I sit there and sweat in the July heat. So that's a very specific image of those houses. What I'm doing is zooming in and giving you little details. The manatee-shaped mailbox, the part of the old Florida Press Association bumper sticker that's at an odd angle on the back. The fact that some of the Christmas lights are missing, they're still up even though it's July. Those are tiny little details. If I just said across the street from us is the Kepper's house, it's a little bit run down, it wouldn't have given you much of a clear image. But because I said the paint is peeling so bad it looks like the house has some kind of disease, I can see them sitting in their recliners watching TV. Those are specific zoomed in images. And it gives you a really clearer picture of what she's looking around and seeing. I'm going to give you another tip here. This is my second tip on setting. And this is actually my favorite setting tip. So if you get nothing else from this little talk, you'll get this. It is the most important thing. Don't just think of your setting as something your character sees. A lot of people think, oh, I'm doing a great job. I'm really describing what my character sees. I'm being very creative in my description of what she sees when she looks around. Well, that's great, but there's a lot more to setting than that. Don't even be satisfied with describing setting as what your character hears or smells. Although those are great too. Those are great details to add. A lot of people will think, oh, I've gone beyond what my character sees. Now I'm describing what they hear, what they smell. I've really got this setting thing down. And those are great. That's really important stuff. But I want you to go beyond that. And I want you to think about setting as something that your character moves through in a three-dimensional way, a space that your character has to navigate or move through. And specifically, I want you to focus on what about that space makes moving through it challenging. What in the setting does your character have to fight against? What is the thing about the setting that makes moving through that space hard and challenging? So I really want you to think about that. What would it be like to move through the space you created? What's in the way? What are the challenges? What are the problems that it causes? This is a little short line from Dark and Shallow Lies. which, as I told you, is set in the Louisiana Bayou. And this main character here, Gray, she has gone walking in the bayou, and she's trying to get back to the boardwalk where the houses are. The closer I get to the boardwalk, the harder it gets to slog through the mud. It sucks and pulls at my boots. I almost lose one. I have to stop and play tug of war with the soggy ground, but I finally win. There's a sickening sound when the mud lets go. So it's not just that it's muddy. I didn't just say it's muddy. I didn't just say it's hard to walk. I was very specific with the way that moving through that space is challenging because of the setting. I play tug of war with the soggy ground for my boots. There's a sickening sound when the mud lets go. Those are the details of moving through that space that make it challenging. This is a little bit from Secrets So Deep. I make my way through the fog toward the light of the farmhouse porch just across the field. The distance seems wide, wide as an ocean. I count my steps out loud, 1,000, 2,000, until there are so many I lose track of the number somehow. I'm still trying to get to the farmhouse. I see the porch light burning in the fog, but something stops me. I can't go any further. I feel the rough wood of a rail fence under my palms. I run my hands along it and hiss in pain as a splinter slices its way into my skin. My mind is trying to make sense of what I'm feeling, but it stutters and stalls because nothing about this makes sense. I feel my way down the fence until I come to where it turns a corner. Then I stumble across the field until I finally reach the farmhouse. So she's talking about that feeling of walking through the fog, of seeing that light of the porch house in the distance, but not being able to get there. And you know how disorienting it can be to move through fog. Distances seem weird. You can't tell what direction you're moving. So that's a challenge in that space. Because it's right there. It's on the seaside at that theater. The fog comes in every night, and it sort of changes the whole landscape that she knows and is familiar with during the day into something at night that is really sort of disorienting and frightening. So really think about the ways your landscape is challenging, the way your setting is challenging. And it doesn't have to be a wild rural landscape for it to be challenging. It doesn't have to be a jungle. It doesn't have to be, the swamp. Walking down a city sidewalk, in a regular city has challenges. Are there cracks in the pavement where the sidewalk is uneven? Is there gum on the sidewalk you have to avoid? Is it busy? Are you bumping into people? What about navigating that space makes it hard, makes it difficult? If your character is sitting at their desk and working and the phone rings and they have to jump up and try to find their phone, are they tripping over their kids' toys? Are they stumbling over the dog? What about that setting, even if it seems like a very mundane, sort of ordinary setting, is challenging when your characters try to move through that space? That's my very, very favorite setting tip. So I'm going to give you one more. This is my third tip. Embrace symbolism and metaphor in your setting. Symbolism and metaphor are great ways to bring layers to your story, to make sure that your story doesn't just work on one level, that it has multiple layers of meaning and context and resonance with your readers. So symbolism and metaphor can do that, and setting is a really great way to embrace symbolism and metaphor. It's my favorite way to find symbolism and metaphor in the work that I'm working on. I'm going to give you an example from Dark and Shallow Lies. All of my work uses setting to sort of work with symbolism and metaphor, but Dark and Shallow Lies does it probably in the most obvious and plain to see way. In that, Gray comes to this town in the bayou. She doesn't live there anymore. She used to, but she comes back to it. And this is the place she loves. It's a place she considers home. She loves the people. She loves visiting there. But as the summer goes on and she starts to uncover some of the ugly things that are happening there, the truth below the surface, she discovers some of the lies and the things that have gone on over the years in this town. The fabric of the town and the people in it starts to decay and rot a little bit. She starts to notice the ugliness underneath. And what's happening actually in the setting directly mirrors what's happening in the town with the people and the relationships and the secrets. You start to see the wildness of the bayou kind of take back over the town. This is a little section from toward the middle of the book. The temperature has become truly suffocating. The bayou loves the heat, though. Honey's roses wither, but the wild things thrive. Cattails and swamp grasses grow tall and thick along the edges of the boardwalk. Someone cuts them down when they threaten to take over, but they come right back, taller and thicker. Vines rise out of the muck to twist around the pilings, reaching up to tug at the white painted planks that blister and peel in the unforgiving sun. Mold and rot creep in around the edges, and the smell of decay is overwhelming. By midday, the air is so thick that it's like trying to breathe wet cotton. So we see sort of the decay and the rot that is so prevalent underneath the goings on in the town start to mirror itself in the setting. And what happens by the end of that book, as Gray really finds out the truth about what happened to her friend who disappeared, the secrets and the lies and the cover-ups that have been going on in this town for generations, we see that nature kind of takes back over, that the swamp sort of gets its revenge, and it absorbs that town sort of back into the Mississippi River, back into the swamp, back into the bayou. And that's a very symbolic and metaphorical thing to happen, of course. And it happens and it works really well because of the setting and the way that I'm using setting to make that happen. It doesn't have to be anything that obvious. It could be something smaller. It could be something not quite as huge. In One Last Breath, which takes place in Florida, it's about the two girls who are free divers. True has a lot of stress in her life. She's getting ready to go to college, but she doesn't really know if she wants to go. She's got this relationship with this boy that she's been with for years, but she doesn't really know how she feels about that either. Her mother is an alcoholic. She's dealing with all sorts of problems, but she finds a lot of peace and calm under the surface of the water. So being below the surface in the stillness and the quiet of those dives helps her center herself and helps her bring herself back to a place of calm, where she can think and she can focus and she can operate better. And so that becomes very metaphorical, the idea of water kind of washing us clean and washing the troubles away, and her being under that water and being peace, and the sort of the irony of the place you can't breathe being the only place you're able to really breathe and relax. So that's very metaphorical and it's very symbolic, and that's a thing that is used pretty often in that story. So the metaphor and the symbolism doesn't always have to be huge. It can be something small, but look for ways to tie your setting into metaphor and symbolism. This talk that I'm giving you guys right now, the talk about setting, I'm trying to cram a lot of stuff into kind of a short space. So I hope that you're getting it all. I hope you're able to make sense of what I'm saying. I do a longer talk on setting that's got a whole bunch more points in this. I'm giving you guys kind of the highlights, the top three. But those are my main three favorite setting tricks. Focus on those zoomed in small details. Make sure that you're thinking of setting as something 3D, a three-dimensional thing that you are moving through. What is the challenge? What is your character fighting against as they move through that space? And then look for ways to embrace the symbolism and the metaphor specifically through your setting. Those are my three main tips. I have a bunch more tips if you ever get to come and hear me do the longer version of this. I'd love to talk to you more about setting because it's one of my favorite things to talk about. But the last thing I want to say is make sure that when you use setting, that you really embrace it so that it wraps around everything in the story. That means your plot is impacted by the setting, your characters are impacted by the setting. Those characters can only be those characters because they exist in this specific place that you've given them to exist. Make sure that it all blends together, it all ties together, it all works together. And specifically, if you're talking about voice, I want to talk about that for just a second. Voice is one of those things that gets mentioned a lot. We love the idea of voice as writers. A lot of reviews and things of my work talk a lot about voice and how interesting and unusual and wonderful the voice is. Voice is one of those things that no one can really define exactly. We know it when we hear it, we know it when we read it, but it's hard to pin down, it's hard to define, and it's even harder to teach. Very, very difficult to teach voice. A lot of times it's kind of one of those things you either have or you don't. But here is something about voice that can be taught, and it has to do with setting. The easiest way to pin down voice, to make voice specific, is to really tie your voice to your setting. What are the ways that those people in that place speak? What are the words they use? What are the phrases they use? What is the rhythm of their speech like? What is the tempo of their speech like? What dialect do they have? What regionalisms? What makes them and the way they speak and express themselves different from the way someone else speaks and express themselves? I never recommend that writers write in dialect. Readers hate to read characters written in heavy dialect. It's complicated, it's hard, it's confusing. Nobody likes that. Um, Writers hardly ever get it right. So don't write in dialect, but think about word choices, think about rhythms, think about tempos, and the way that speech from different parts of the country or different parts of the world or different groups culturally sound, and try to put that flavor into the story that you're writing. And in that way, setting can really influence voice. It can really affect the way you tell a story. In Dark and Shallow Lies, particularly because it takes place in the bayou, the character of Gray, the main character, is not Cajun. She's not Creole. She doesn't belong to either of those groups. She's kind of an outsider who comes into that place. But there are characters in that story, of course, who are Cajun, who are Creole. And although I did not write in a dialect for those characters, I did pick out one or two words, one or two pronunciations, and used those one or two things to give the flavor of that dialect. And what I really focused on is rhythm. The way that characters speak and the way that their voice sounds and the sort of the musicality that different cultures and different backgrounds and different regional places have for their speech. So that's another way you can really use setting, is to influence your voice. And it's an easy way to give your writing some voice if that's something that you're looking for. So I want to tell you, thank you very much for hanging out with me and talking about setting today. Like I said, setting is one of my favorite things to talk about. I truly love setting. My fourth book, which I just turned into my editor a couple of weeks ago, will be out in 2025. It takes place in the Ozarks of Arkansas. So another really setting heavy, really setting rich story. And I think that I will continue probably to tell stories that have really important settings or that are heavily influenced by settings, just because they're so much fun to write. And those are the kinds of things I love to read as a reader too. So if you are interested in following along more about me and the things I'm doing and the stuff I'm working on, my name is Ginny Sain. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and all of this stuff. Sort of on TikTok. I'm working on that. I'm not on there a lot, but I'm trying to get on there. But I'd love to chat with you. I always love to chat with writers and to meet other writers on social media and hear what you're working on and hear what you're reading and all of that good stuff. So thank you for hanging out with me today, and happy writing.